the next speaker will then actually give us more detail on one of the elements of this initiative. So Dr. Ivo Volman is from the European Commission Publications Office in Luxembourg, and he is the head of the Common Portal and Open Data Portal unit in the Publications Office in Luxembourg. So this is one of the elements of this open science initiative. He holds a PhD in European law, and he worked in the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs in the area of industrial and technology policy, and joined the European Commission in '88, where he dealt with legislative and strategic issues, information market, digitization, very difficult word, and data. So we are looking forward to hear more details on one of these elements, and Dr. Volman will present on the European Commission's open data strategy and the EU open data portal. Please.
Good morning. I've been working on open data on and off for the last 15 years in the Commission. And one thing I noticed is that, well, the rooms became bigger and bigger and the crowds became larger and larger, which started something that started as something for geeks. Reuse of public sector information has now become basically mainstream. Now, obviously, some of the sectors go a bit faster, mapping information, meteorological information, statistics, but all these sectors are coming on board, slowly but surely. And still, it takes quite something to change mentalities. A question to the room, are there any data huggers in the room? Data huggers, people who, yes, I see someone who admits it. Now, these are just some of the excuses that I came across when trying to convince people that actually they should open up their data. There was a mayor in the UK who said, but my data are boring. I mean, what could anyone possibly do with my data? Now, more common is the point, hey, this is ours. We decide what's going to happen with the data, not someone at the national government or in Brussels. The next one is very important, actually, for the scientific community. There's very often the fear that if you leave the data to people who are not really specialists, they will do something completely wrong with it. And I've seen that across the scientific sectors, not so much in the broader government departments. Well, and then there's the fear that other people may try to make money out of your data. Well, what's wrong with that? The basic principle of open data is that the public has paid for this, so why shouldn't it be open for all to use and to consult? Another nice one that I heard is that people are afraid that actually their data will be scrutinized. I got a comment like that last week when talking to one of our colleague institutions in the European Union. Yes, but if we make it better available, people will start really looking at it, and it may be wrong, actually. Well, then there is sloppy rights management, another issue. Sometimes people don't know whether they have the right to publish data. And, well, a last one, the data is just too large to be published and used. That's also a nice excuse. Now, I'm not saying there may not be good excuses not to publish any data. Of course, the privacy issue is a big one, and I think it will be tackled later on in one of the talks. It's a very big one. But there are many of the excuses I heard that really don't hold. And actually, there are very good reasons to open up your data. Now, first of all, opening up data that has been paid for by the public sector can lead to huge economic activity. It has been estimated at 40 billion euros a year. As the old Commission said, that's no coffee money. And actually, there are other estimates. A McKinsey report that's even higher. Now, economic growth is nice, but transparency is also an important buzzword at the moment. And of course, it's not just a buzzword. Transparency is very important. And the last point, opening up data will lead to better decision making. If you take figures, facts, as a basis for decision making, and not just the political instinct of politicians, you get to better decisions. And Jean-Claude said it already before, opening up data is part of the digital single market strategy. Just a very simple example of reuse of food data. Well, this is a very simple app. It's called Food Alert. It's based on the dissemination of food alerts by the Belgian government. It's taken up by a firm that has transformed it into an app and serves it to the users. Okay, public sector information, in a broad sense, it goes beyond the scientific data, has been on the agenda, although rather timidly in the beginning, for years. In 2003, the European Union adopted legislation on the reuse of public sector information, which actually was more, well, competition-like legislation to avoid that there was unloyal competition by public sector bodies to market players. It also had an open data component pushing member states to open up all their government data. Now, when we were negotiating this directive, there was a question that came on the table. So, yes, you're preaching, but what are you doing yourself? European Commission, other institutions? Very fair question. So that's why in 2006 there was an instrument adopted, a reuse decision of Commission information, which is one of the most open reuse regimes that you can find in the world. And that decision was reviewed in 2011, and that was also the basis of creating an open data portal at European level. 2013, a very important year for open data. European Council made a strong statement in favor of open data. European Council is the heads of government and state. The G8, Mr. Obama and the others made an open data charter, or signed an open data charter. And another important thing is that the directive, so the legislation on the reuse of public sector information, was very much strengthened, and basically giving out data that have been publicly paid for free became the norm rather than the exception. If you look where the different countries stand in terms of the PSI scoreboard, now this is not an assessment of government policies, this is an assessment of all the activities around public sector information across Europe. You see some nice, well, things that perhaps you wouldn't expect, that actually some of the southern countries are doing better than some of the northern countries. Okay, I come to this open data portal that we are running. This is what it looks like. And sometimes the question is, do we really need a portal? Aren't portals something of the last decade? Well, I think this portal can have a real function in bringing together fragmented resources. So imagine the power you would have if you bring together all the data, information from the different policy DGs, the different agencies, the GRC that's doing a lot of research. And if you would be able to combine those data sets, actually if these data sets would be harmonized, you would have a quite powerful tool. And what's perhaps even more important, I think that this portal is driving a new way of producing the data. So we must make sure that the people, when they produce the data, already take into account the interoperability and take into account that this may be used together with other data. Now, for the user, there are some clear advantages. The terms of use, just one set of terms of use, so that they know what they can expect. An easy search, and there's also on the portal showcases and an interaction with the user community. So who do we have on this EU Open Data Portal at the moment? We've got 26 of the Commission DGs, the other big institutions, and 23 agencies. Now, there's one weakness in terms of the content for this audience, that there's not so much information on food and food safety on the portal. It's actually rather poor at the moment. But the good news is that well, we're working together with EFSA to make that change, and we hope that the EFSA data are going to come soon on the portal. I see someone smiling of the EFSA crowd. So. It's not just human readable, but also machine readable. Okay, who would use this kind of data? Who would come to this portal? And why would people use it? Well, most people actually use it simply to obtain more information about the EU. There's also quite a lot of use for scientific purposes and journalistic purposes. And still a significant number of people say that they use the data for making new applications, so the economic growth and jobs line. Now, this is almost my last slide. The portal with the information for the EU institutions is going to feed into something bigger that's going to be launched at the end of this year, which is a pan-European open data portal. The beta version will be released by November 2015, and it's all part of this big thrust towards making data more easily accessible and usable across Europe. Okay, I come to my conclusion. I hope I stayed within the time. Now, it's obvious that the data revolution will affect all the sectors that you can think of. And of course, food and food safety is going to be hugely affected. Now, within the bigger picture of big data, open data has an enormous social and economic potential, economic growth and jobs, but also better policy making and also more transparency. And last but not least, we are trying to do what we preach, and as European Commission and European institutions, we try to open up our data sets as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. So to the EFSA colleagues, the pressure is on. They're waiting for input. And you mentioned also repeatedly transparency, which is an important aspect. I think this is why we have all these transparent chairs here to illustrate this. So I think we have time for one or two quick questions. For clarification, again, we have the panel discussion in the end. Are there any questions? Please. Right.
Leif Busk, Sweden, National Food Agency. Did I get you correct that the biggest interest in science came from physics to use open data at the time?
Are you talking about the slide, who is using the portal, right? Well, first of all, this is not about scientific information. This is all types of information that come from the European institutions, including scientific data from the GRC, including data from different agencies. Now, the biggest interest is actually from the general public that wants to get an insight in what the European Union is doing and what is happening with taxpayers' money there, right? But the second biggest group were people who said that they used the data that are on the portal for scientific purposes. And that could be any scientific purpose. It could be social sciences, it could be law, but it could also be the hard sciences. All right?
Thank you very much. Well, Nigel, burning question.
So there's a very similar, Nigel Walker, NTP, there's a similar initiative in the US through NIH-funded research to do the similar kind of thing. Is there any plan to make sure that the EU portals are interoperable with other portals around the world so you can actually get to a global portal? Because if they're not talking to each other, we'll just have a similar situation that you showed as the as-is slide, just different groups of different portals that can't talk to each other.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and it always comes up when we do something at the European level. Of course, there are talks with the Americans. At the same time, I think we should first get our own house in order and try to get something running between the member states and not take into account, well, from the beginning, all the constraints that there could be, because if you try to do that, then you never get anywhere. Perhaps Jean-Claude can say something more about it. Your question is about the NHS, which is more scientific information related. So, but that can perhaps be later, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very pertinent point because, in particular, if you talk about data sharing, I think it's of critical importance, actually, with all due respect, but to have dialogue early on to avoid incompatibilities later on in concepts and in sharing. Maybe that's a point we can then elaborate a bit more in the panel discussion in the end, because I do believe it's a very important aspect. Thank you very much for that.